Yep. So if maybe if we could all grab some seats, grab our coffee. We'll let the AV guys. I'm going to vamp a little bit while the AV guys let me know that they were good to go. But first of all, most important thing of the day. Does everybody know what the date today is? March 9th? Oh, sorry, March 10th. What happens on March 11th at 2 a.m.? Daylight savings time, that is correct. So tomorrow, when you're here for Zahida's amazing keynote, you have to set your clock by 1 hour so that you're actually here on time for her amazing keynote. That means that tonight you want to go home probably 1 hour earlier so you get a little bit of sleep, you're rested and ready to go tomorrow.
Of course, if you know you're going to arrive an hour early, you still won't be late.
But anyways, cool. So we've got a few more folks just started streaming in the back, and we'll get started here in just a moment. Some other administrative things. If you are, how many folks? I heard people yelling about game night. How many folks here have been to game night before? Yeah. Yep. Game night and happy hour. That'll be happening right behind me in the other half of the exhibit hall where the booths aren't. We'll be there starting. We've got a family hour for the first hour of the event. That's where you should take your kids, your families, and enjoy a wholesome good time with all the games. While that is happening, all of you adults, I know we're all kids of all ages, but the adults, if you could please be in this room for upscale. We have some amazing Ignite-style lightning talks taking place from 8 to 9 while the game night is kicking off. Cool. So one thing I always like to do every year is kind of get a quick survey. How many folks are here at Scale for the first time? Yep. Cool. So first, I want to say welcome to our community. We see Scale as a family. The way I describe when I tell my coworkers that I'm going to disappear for a week to go plan Scale in LA, I tell them that I'm planning a party for my 3,500 closest friends and family, and that they are welcome to join as well. So we do consider this the Scale family, and we do hope that you'll come back in the future. At the same time, I'd ask, how many of you have all been to all of the Scales? 1. There's 2. You guys are all just embarrassed to be the old timers? Cool. So we started this about 16 years ago, give or take. We shifted time of the year, but about 16 years ago in a small conference room at USC, thanks to the support of USC and UCLA. And we thought, if we put a conference together, some of our favorite speakers will have to come. It'll be just that easy. Turns out, not exactly true, but it worked out. It worked out quite well, and so 16 years later, we're still doing this. Most of the core team's still involved. So again, this is a labor of love. If you see somebody wearing a yellow tech shirt with a Wi-Fi password on it, it's Pasadena, by the way. Please thank them for their efforts. If you see somebody wearing one of these jerseys, do the same. And if you love Scale and want to help make it continue to happen, please email us, volunteer, help out next year. It doesn't happen with all the effort of about 60 to 70 volunteers each year that pull this show together. Also, if you see something that you don't like, please volunteer, because you can be the change you want to see. So cool. Last announcement: if you are interested in security, we have a set of capture the flag events taking place in the lower lobby next door all afternoon. The first one starts at 1:30 for beginners, and then throughout the day we move on to intermediate, and then tomorrow we have advanced opportunities as well. There are prizes. Top 3 contestants will win things from folks from Signal Sciences and a few other sponsors out there. Speaking of Signal Sciences, if you're in any of the session rooms this week and you notice there's power in the back 3 to 4 rows, that is courtesy of Signal Sciences. They were kind enough to sponsor what they're calling on-call seating. Lots of you are on call. Who's on call this weekend carrying a pager? Cool. Those seats are for those people. It's kind of like on the bus or in the subway. There's a handicapped seat for the elderly or the pregnant women or the disabled. On-call is they're doing duty so that we can all be enjoying the event. So please make sure that they get those seats first. It's not for your Angry Birds or your Snapchat or whatever it is that you think you need the power for. It's for them to get work done. So with that, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our fine keynote speaker today. So we have John Gossman with us today. He's joining us from Microsoft. How many folks ever thought you'd see a Microsoft keynote here at Scale? So Microsoft's actually been quite kind to Scale. They've sponsored both Scale and DevOps Days many times over the years, and I know that we like to give them some jabs at times for some of their interactions, maybe over a decade ago. But the amazing thing is that we've got John here today to tell us about the journey of how we got from that maybe acrimonious relationship to actually one of the more friendly and supportive open source and commercial relationships I've seen in my 20-some odd years of open source. And I know there's lots of old timers here as well that have been in this community. I don't know why you're laughing. I'm not looking at you. But folks that have been in this community for quite some time, and I think they would all agree that this is that there's quite a bit of good happening here. So again, John is a distinguished engineer on the Azure team at Microsoft, and he's going to be taking us through a bit of Microsoft's open source evolution and how we got to where we are today. So thank you for taking the time with us on a weekend. I know you've had a long week of conferences already, but looking forward to hearing your story.
All right. Thank you. Now I'll see how loud that is. Is that as loud to all of you as it is to me? Try not to deafen you while they maybe can adjust it a little bit down. But thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming to see me. And I hope you enjoy what I have to say. I'm here to talk about Microsoft's journey to open source. The question really is how did we get from a company where in 2001, Steve Ballmer said that Linux was a cancer, that it attached itself to IP, to a point where we have large services running on Linux, and we are contributing and creating and working with many, many open source projects. And so to tell this story, I'm remembering creative writing class where they said, don't tell, show. So I'm not here to sell you on anything, any sort of Microsoft product. However, these points along this path and some other projects that are off kind of to the right on this path, I'm going to tell you about them as a way of showing you what we're doing and also explaining our general approach towards open source and towards Linux and how, as a way of describing how we changed. So, again, my name is John Gossman. I'm a distinguished engineer, which means I'm an old engineer. I have been a programmer for over 30 years. I started out as a graphics programmer, did a lot of different CAD and multimedia, and eventually, in 2000, I was at Visio as a graphics developer yet again, when Microsoft acquired me. And I guarantee you, at that point, when Visio was acquired, I never expected to be standing at Scale talking about Linux. In those 18 years at Microsoft, I've worked in Office, I've worked in developer division, I've worked in Windows, and then the last 5 years, I've worked in Azure. And remember, I was a graphics developer. So when I switched over to Azure 5 years ago, I took the job because a friend of mine advised me to take the job that I knew the least about. And the first meeting that I came to, these people talked about something to do with cloud and PaaS and IaaS and all sorts of things. And my boss, who just hired me, turned to me at the end of the meeting and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I don't understand a single word any of you said, including and the." And for the first 6 months, I will be honest, I actually thought I had made a mistake. I thought I had leaped too far from being a client developer to being a cloud developer. But the one thing that I did know from being a developer all those years, working inside and outside Microsoft, was the sort of things that developers appreciate. So I started focusing in Azure for the first little while on our REST APIs, on our SDKs, on our CLIs, on our developer documentation, and other experiences. And that led me to this interesting world of DevOps. Now, I was a dev, but as a graphics developer, we didn't do a lot of ops. And I got very fascinated with these DevOps tools because I saw it as applying all the agile, lean software development practices that we had learned, in the 80s and 90s, to extend that into operations. And that led me to meeting and partnering with companies like Chef and Puppet and Mesosphere and Docker in this DevOps world largely. And the fact was that all those tools, all of them targeted Linux, and all of them were open source. And that was my introduction. I had, back in the early 90s, I used GCC to port some graphics code from Solaris to Ultrix to HBUX. But that was pretty much the extent of my open source experience up until that point. But my intro then was with Chef, and that's led on to a series of other, working with Linux, which led to this really strange experience I had a year and a half ago of walking into the Linux Foundation board meeting as the first ever Microsoft representative to the Linux Foundation board. And Jim Zemlin, who was the chairman of the board, introduced me, and I got a standing ovation. It wasn't me, it was a standing ovation for Microsoft to show up in this kind of unexpected place. Followed by 5 hours of hell just froze over jokes. And I'm not sensitive about these things, and it's fine. I get it. But honestly, just honestly, there's not that many variations. After 2 hours, those jokes weren't that funny anymore. So today, I'm here to talk about, again, about our journey, our history with open source. And I'm going to start a little bit to the left of that chart where it talks about 2004, the start of our open source journey. In fact, I'm going to start in 4000 BC. I thought we needed some real broad context here. Have any of you read this book, Sapiens? So Sapiens is basically, it's a relatively recent, it's a historian from Oxford, I think, and it's the history of the human species, all the way from deep evolutionary origins, and it talks about the evolution of language, and culture, and the agricultural evolution, scientific evolution, and other things. It's an interesting, good perspective on the whole world. But one of the things I was struck by, I never thought about this before, is he said that at the end of the beginning of the agricultural revolution, which he said was about 4000 BC, until really the Renaissance, in Eurasia at least, there was no technological change for farmers. That 90% of the people in the world were farmers, and that the skills of being able to, that they had as a farmer in 4000 BC and 1000 AD were about the same. So the way I see this is, imagine that you're a poor Mesopotamian farmer in 4000 BC, and a UFO swoops down and lands and picks you up, and takes you off into space at relativistic speeds to some distant globular cluster where they're going to experiment on you or something else. But they're nice, so they bring you back. And they drop you off back in Mesopotamia in about 1000 AD, 5,000 years later. And it's 6 months have passed because of relativistic time. Well, that farmer, at that point, could have submitted their resume to that era's equivalent of LinkedIn and gotten a job as an agricultural engineer, because the basic skill set was the same. They didn't have any new things. They might have had an iron knife instead of a bronze knife, but feeding the pigs and planting the wheat and all that sort of thing was pretty much the same after 5,000 years. A little contrast from today. If they made a mistake and they dropped them off in, say, Mesoamerica instead, where it was maize instead of wheat, or China and it was millet instead of wheat, that would have been a change. But that would have probably been no worse than having to go from like a Python shop to a Ruby shop. Meanwhile, we today live in this world that I like to call a world of science fiction, in the sense that when I was young and watching Star Trek, they had these communicator things. If somebody gave me a Star Trek communicator from the original show, I would throw away because it's an obsolete cell phone now, right? It's really bad tech. And so in my lifetime, those things have changed considerably. And I thought at one point, well, this probably has a lot to do with me being old, that the world's changed, and probably all old people feel this way after a while. But I've been talking to my friends, teenagers, and it's the same thing. They said, look, with social networking and everybody having cell phones, the world around has just changed dramatically in such a very, very short change. And I have one more story before I get back into our story. I have a friend who is a writer, and she was writing a couple years ago a near-future bio-thriller. It's called Sea of a Thousand Words. It's about terrorists get a hold of CRISPR gene therapy, and they're going to wipe out all sorts of people. And she's not a STEM person, so she's a good writer, but she's not a STEM person. And so I was kind of advising her about the tech on the computer side, and her daughter, who's a biologist, was advising her about CRISPR gene editing and things like that. And the first thing we had to tell her was, you can't set this book 25 years in the future. It has to be more like 5 years in the future, because all these things were changing so fast. And the other amazing thing, too, was in the next 18 months, every once in a while, there'd be like a newspaper article, and they say, oh, we made this advance in CRISPR. And it's like, that's in the book. I have to, that's now, and she started joking, this book is going to go, I have to finish it before it goes from being science fiction to being historical fiction. So in that very broad context, developers' lives are changing too. When I started out, you were a C++ programmer, or a C programmer, or a PL1 programmer, and you targeted a particular operating system. You were a Unix person, or you were a Windows person. Well, Windows came later. And that's really about a lot of how you identify yourself. Well, not only are things changing faster, but a lot of people now are what they call polyglot programmers. Use the right language for the right job. It's JavaScript on the front end. It's C++ or Java on the back end. Some Python for your machine learning stuff. And there's a wide range of technologies. Likewise, we have DevOps people who are doing operations and development, which is a change. We have people who are full stack developers who do everything from the front end to the database and everything in between. So developers not only have a lot of things that are changing, like the cloud or smartphone technology or things like that. This is very different from that Mesopotamian farmer who for 5,000 years he could use the same skill set, or even from being able to use the same skill set for a decade or so like I did early in my career. So in that context, I want to talk about Microsoft and our journey to open source. And I want to start off on the far left here, something like 6,000 years after the agricultural revolution, with a project called Wix. Wix stands for Windows Installer XML Toolkit. I saw at least one person who has used Wix. So before Wix existed, I had to write several Windows installers. Literally, Visio 6, it took us longer to write the installer than it did to write that version of Visio. It was really, really, really hard things. So, totally by coincidence, because it's on this slide, but it's coincidence that I happened to be there. In about 2004, I was sharing a test lab with a gentleman named Rob Mensching. And Rob was the author of this Wix toolkit. And it made writing installers much, much easier. And I think Rob worked in Office at the time. And he had a small team writing this installer for Office. And he built this toolkit. And Rob wanted to open source this toolkit, which made a lot of sense because lots of people were writing installers. And he had a small team. And even though it was a very important product that he was writing the installer for, he realized that there were lots of customers. And he had two things. One, he wanted to make it easier for customers, Microsoft Windows customers, to install their stuff, but also he wanted help from all those people. He couldn't implement all the features in Wix by himself or his team, and he wanted to build a community around this thing. The business proposition for this seems to be fairly innocuous. This is a toolkit that makes it easier for people to install applications running on Windows. Even in 2004, that was a pretty obvious thing. But Rob found this big challenge about the fact that basically very, very few people at Microsoft at that time understood open source. They didn't understand the licenses, they didn't understand the implications. Now, he happened to meet a gentleman named Stephen Wally at the time, who is sitting here in the front row. And Steve and Rob met a lot with lawyers, and had this experience, hashed out the experience, and eventually after several months, they got permission to open source this thing. And I can remember talking to Rob at the time. I was not doing open source, I was working on something else, but we were in the lab and I was talking to him. And it seemed like there was an experience where the lawyers were telling him what he could and could not do in this space. But in retrospect, what was actually happening was that Steve and Rob were educating the lawyers and forcing them to learn how these licenses worked and how this process worked. And they had executive reviews, and people realized, okay, this is not a big deal. So I think this is a really appropriate project to be at this point in this project, because it kind of laid a lot of groundwork. Even though it was minor, people didn't maybe see the significance of the time for a lot of the work that we've done since. So I'm going to jump forward along this timeline. I'll come back to some of these other projects later. But I want to give you 4 examples to kind of show you where we are now. And the first one I'm going to bring up is our Linux investments. In 2009, Microsoft surprised a lot of people by contributing a bunch of code to the Linux kernel. This code was designed to support Microsoft's new hypervisor, Hyper-V. We had discovered, not surprisingly, that if you're trying to do server consolidation using hypervisors, that you need to be able to run more than just Windows in those places. You need to be able, not really, if you're going to have a hypervisor, probably need to run multiple different operating systems. And in order to make it fast, so that you're not just software emulating all of the I/O drivers, you need to do some driver work in the kernel. And so we contributed kernel work. We hired a small team of people to work on those sort of enlightenments inside the Linux kernel. That team's larger version of that team still works at Microsoft today, and in addition to making sure that Linux continues to work great inside Hyper-V, they also make sure that Linux works great on Azure. We add GPUs, and you need to have a driver that can talk out through the hypervisor to that driver. We add accelerated networking that takes the, a lot of the NCAP and DCAP off the CPU and puts it onto the NIC, and you need to have a hardware driver in order to take advantage of that performance. And this team to this day is adding features to that thing to do that. And as a result of this early work, 9 years ago now, today over 40% of the VMs on Azure are running Linux. And we have a series of other services. For example, we have a Hadoop service that runs on Linux and runs Spark and Hadoop on top of Azure. Now, enabling Linux to run on top of Hyper-V and in Azure was very helpful to customers who wanted to do those sort of things. But very quickly, after we got Linux working on Azure, we started getting people asking for more. They wanted other things, databases, for example. And so where have developers put all of our state in our applications for the last 25 years? We put it into the database. Even if it didn't make any sense. Maybe it was relational, maybe it was lucky, maybe tables of names think it great, works right. But if it was like pictures of the kids, we put that data into the relational database. And the reason for that is because then it became the DBA's problem. Developers no longer, DevOps is different, so now we have this thing. But at the time, it's like, now we have somebody else who will make sure that the database server gets updated, that it's available, that it gets backed up, all those sorts of things. Now, in the cloud, as a developer, if you want to run a database, a Postgres or MySQL or SQL Server or Oracle or whatever, you can run it inside a VM. But then you're back in this problem, well, maybe you also still have a DBA that can work with you in the cloud. But one of the most popular things in any cloud is a managed database service, because the cloud vendor then becomes responsible for doing all those backups and restores and patching the server, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had a relational database service running in Azure that was running, unsurprisingly, SQL Server. But if you take a developer who has written their application against MySQL or Postgres, and you say, hey, you have 2 choices. You can run VMs and operate that database yourself, and that will work. Or you can switch to SQL Server. That is a very short conversation. It lasts about 5 minutes before they drive across the lake to one of the other cloud vendors. So just last year, we announced that the SQL Server team that was operating the SQL service, they also now are operating MySQL and Postgres services. They're the same thing. It's the real MySQL and Postgres code running as a service with all this replication and other features, and it makes it much, much easier, if that's your database, to switch to the thing. So this is an example. We've gone beyond just enabling, making sure it works, and now, good luck, but actually combining that with a service, to adding value, customer value, making it easier for the customer to use. My third example is very different from the first two. How many people use TypeScript? Never tell what that's going to be. It depends heavily from audience to audience. TypeScript is a type-safe superset of JavaScript. And because it's type-safe and has a lot of pre-compiled options, you can find a lot of errors early, but it's completely compatible. You can use JavaScript libraries, et cetera, et cetera. And it compiles down to JavaScript, so it'll run anywhere that JavaScript will, which is basically anywhere. And the creator of TypeScript is a gentleman named Anders Hejlsberg. You may know him. He was also the designer of the C# language and Turbo Pascal before that. So Anders is one of the most valuable employees at Microsoft, as well as being just literally one of the most legendary language designers of all time. And TypeScript is his new project. And it's entirely on GitHub. Anders is the leading contributor. You can go in and make a pull request, and you might get rejected by Anders, or you might get accepted by Anders. Certainly, you'll get comments. And if you talk to Anders, he just loves the process, because much more than anything he'd ever done before, he feels like he collaborates directly with his users, the language users, as well as with the programming language community. So just go back really briefly. The point of that one is this is a case where we are using open source development methodologies for our own products, building a community around them, but also just because, as Anders has seen, it's just, for that sort of thing in particular, just a better way of doing development than anything he'd done before. So I've talked about a couple of things we've given for customers. I've talked about using open source methodologies. You may be wondering, is there anything that Microsoft is doing that's like mission critical that's using open source? So I want to tell you about SONiC. SONiC stands for I can never remember what Software Networking in Cloud. I would have loved to have been in the meeting when they came up with that acronym. But what it is that, as you can imagine, in a big cloud, you have an enormous number of hardware switches that are in the middle of the network. And we have all sorts of custom software in our SDN stack, and so we actually write the software for those switches. And for very many reasons, there are very, very few switches in the history of the world that were running Windows. It's been a Unix. So honestly, it's mostly been a BSD thing over time. But a few years ago, when the team decided to update the software for the switches, they chose to build it on Debian Linux. They chose to use Docker for all of the different components so that they could update the various parts of the switch software independently and pull in different dependencies and not have them collide with each other. And it was simply because they thought this was the best software for the job. And so this is critical. Like all the network, it's being rolled out. They have some older switches, but eventually all the networking traffic that goes on inside all of our databases, all of our data centers all over the world is going to be running through this switch. And the team also open sourced that whole stack. So you can go to GitHub and find the code for this thing, both as a process of like, let's give back, we're using all these components, let's give back some stuff, as well as this turns out to be a really great way to collaborate with the switch manufacturers so that they can test and know how things are working. So those 4 examples, I just give them as illustrations of our general approach to open source. And this is Microsoft at this point. We're still evolving, but this is where we are at this point. First of all, we want to enable our customers to use whatever software and other products that they are using well on our platforms. You can't be, a hypervisor vendor and not support other operating systems. You can't be a cloud vendor and only support certain software stacks. Every enterprise in the world, and even small startups, they use a wide variety of software, and they have a lot of choices. So it's very important to enable those things. Then, where we can see how we can combine it with other software and services to make a better experience, we try and integrate those things. So that's the example of MySQL and Postgres, and we have we're building a Kubernetes service, and we have Spark and Hadoop services, etc. Then we're using open source methodology ourselves in the cases like TypeScript and a bunch of other examples, some of which I'll talk about later, to release software now and maintain software. We're always trying to contribute back. And in a case like Sonic, we're both using and contributing back in various different ways. So what changed? How did we get that big gap? And now it's been time, it's been 17 years at least, so what changed? Well, first of all, the industry changed. I think there were not a lot of examples that people could look at for companies who had a successful open source business. There was lots of successful open source projects, but you can imagine that at a software company, you might like to say, how are we going to make money with this? There doesn't seem to be other examples. Red Hat, obviously, has led the way here and shown that you can make this a great business. And now there's a lot of open source businesses. There's various open source database vendors. There's people that have a mix of proprietary and open source in their strategy. In fact, there's very, very few companies left in the world that don't have at least some usage or release of open source software. Our customers changed. Honestly, just like Microsoft in the late 90s, and I still run into enterprises today, weren't sure about this whole open source thing. I still run into, there are customers that we're not really sure. Should we use open source? How do we control it? Where is it coming from? Who do we call if it doesn't work? And that has changed just, dramatically, incredibly over time. And I've got some examples of different companies and their statements about why they were going to use open source. And then open source is also driving a lot of digital transformation. Certainly the web technologies that are all open source, but also the AI, machine learning, and big data spaces. A lot of those projects came out of academia. All those things are open source. Cassandra, Hadoop, Spark. On the AI side, TensorFlow and Onyx and CNTK, which comes from Microsoft. My colleague Mark gave a talk last week at the Open Source Leadership Summit and he pointed out that especially in a space like AI ML, where a lot of it's experiments, it's really, really important that the data sets and the code itself be open source, because that's the only way you can actually reproduce an experiment. Somebody publishes a paper and they say, oh, we've improved vision this much, or we can identify faults in airplane engines this much. How can you reproduce that experiment if you don't have access to the software and the data sets? So certain areas in particular, open source is just like really, really leading, and and you can't work in that space without working with open source and contributing back. And then finally, we changed. Inside the company, I don't know what the number is, but we've expanded enormously. We hire a lot of software developers, and it's when I came to Microsoft in 2000, other than using GCC and a couple of other things like that, I didn't have a lot of open source experience. You pretty much can't hire anyone from the rest of industry, certainly not out of college anymore, that doesn't have open source experience. So that means that they understand open source much better, and and their resumes depend on open source, and they're not going to come work for you if they can't work on open source. So that's the thing. And our leadership's changed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the combination of, if you have a groundswell of your employees and you have leadership that's changed, that's the sort of thing that requires to change culture. Now, the culture of Microsoft is a developer culture. We have had a lot of other products over the years, but Bill and Paul started the company writing BASIC. They were programmers writing a product for other programmers. And even though Office and Windows and Azure now have eclipsed the developer division as being the biggest business components of Microsoft, developer division is in many ways still that extension of BASIC. That's why C# and TypeScript and before that Visual Basic were still being developed in developer division. And I spent a lot of my time in developer division. I still think a developer division is kind of the core of the company. But basically, Microsoft is a company by, of, and for developers. There was somebody who tweeted, Jess Frizzell, some of you may know, a couple weeks ago, she saw Scott Guthrie, who's one of the vice presidents of Microsoft, giving a talk, and she said, Microsoft has a lot of nerdy executives. And I was reminded of that, and I didn't send it to her, but like, you know, when I was growing up, if you looked up the word nerd in the dictionary, which probably wasn't in the dictionary, but if you had, it had a picture of Bill Gates. So it's really not that surprising that that's still kind of the case. And developers love open source. And it's just, we like to be able to get our hands on the code. If you have a choice between not having the code and having the code, you'll take having the code every single time. We like to be able to show off to each other what we have worked on. It's a great way to learn. I learned operating systems using Andy Tannenbaum's book, the thing that was before Linux. Was that Minix? What was that? And you know, the fact that the source code was available made it that, you know, the professor handed out these courses, and we went in and we implemented kernel features that was impossible without. So another great reason to love open source. And it's especially valuable in these times of rapid change, because with change, things are changing so fast, you really want to have access to the code so that you can figure out what's changing, maybe freeze it at some point, and have a lot of control over what's going on. Now, from a business point of view, one of the best advantages of open source is it allows you to scale your development beyond what can be done in a single organization. No matter how big you are and how many developers you hire, you can never get all, or even most, or even more than a small percentage of all the smart people that are working on code in the world. And especially, we tend to have common problems. So why should we, you know, all do our own separate thing? And so, talking about leadership, then we get to this guy. Satya was a developer at Microsoft and before Microsoft. So he fits very much into that culture. If you think about our leadership is heavily dominated by developers. Bill and Paul, Satya, Scott Guthrie, Terry Myerson, who runs Windows. Almost all of the executives at Microsoft have a development background. Our former CEO was not a developer. He is, however, famous for speaking very loudly and repeatedly about how much he loved developers. So when Satya came in, one of the first things he decided to do was he felt that he needed to make some cultural changes in the company. There were a lot of things that were not going as well as they could, and Satya was brought in to change them. He's written this book, Hit Refresh. I'm not here to sell you any Microsoft products. I'm not here to plug Satya's book. I enjoyed reading it. As a Microsoft employee, I learned a lot about Satya and about how he thinks. And I pulled out just a couple of quotes. I really like this first one. Leaders must be boundaryless and globally minded in seeking solutions. He asks us to think all the time about customers and not worry so much about organizational boundaries or technological boundaries. Some of this is just the old think outside the box. A lot of this is targeted at Microsoft's historically highly siloized internal organization. But I also know, and because he's talked about it, that this includes partnerships and open source. That, you know, try and figure out what the best solution for the customer is and seek on that. And so this next story is, he talks about him and Scott Guthrie traveling to a customer when they were just starting out with Azure. I don't know exactly how long this was, It was already underway when I joined Azure, so it means it was more than 5 years ago, but it was Scott was there, so it was less than 7 years ago when Scott joined Azure. And they talked to this customer, and they came out and they realized that they really, really needed to support Linux in Azure in order to succeed. And the interesting part was, as he said here, this posed a profound cultural change. Because, you know, Drucker said that culture will eat strategy for breakfast every single time. And Satya realized that this group of people that were used to proprietary software and being Windows first and things like that, you would have to make a cultural change in order to follow through on this strategy, or the work would just not be well done. Make a little bit of a change of tone. I'll come back to some of that in a moment. But I want to talk about power of community. If you don't have a community, you might as well just be proprietary source. There's honestly a lot of the open source development things, GitHub and stuff, are very convenient, even if you're just doing private development. But you know, it's really the community that separates open source from private development. So I want to talk a little bit about our experiences with community. I haven't talked to this point about perhaps the most famous open source project, .NET. And a little bit of the journey here. Steve was involved in 2001, 2002 when we did a kind of a reference code drop of some of the .NET code. Then in 2008, Scott Guthrie, who was working in web technologies and was one of the creators of ASP.NET, open sourced the entire ASP.NET web framework for use. And then a few years later, we followed up by slowly open sourcing other parts of .NET, like the compiler, which was new and easy. Some of the old code was a little bit harder to get into shape where it was useful in open source. You need to have documentation, you need to have tools so people can build, that sort of thing. It takes a little while. It literally, if I recall, it took 2 or 3 years for the .NET team to literally build the infrastructure for this large code base so that it was useful in open source. And one of the things I always tell people when they want to open source something is do not expect people to show up and do your work. This is a bad idea. I've had someone recently approach us and say, yeah, we've got this thing, we don't really want to work on it. We think we'll put it in the community and maybe the community will fix all the bugs. It's not how it works at all. You might have a partnership, you may have somebody come and says, we'll work on you with it, but other than that, this is a bad idea. And the .NET community, the leadership knew this well enough from ASP.NET and other things like that. They were not expecting it. So they were very, very surprised when we opened up the GitHub account an hour before we announced it. We had pull requests before it was announced. Over half the contributions to .NET now are coming in from people outside of Microsoft. Great example, Samsung has got these Tizen TVs that run .NET. They did a large chunk of the work to make .NET work on ARM processors. Qualcomm and Intel have been doing custom CPU optimization for .NET to make their chips shine, which is another interesting point about communities. You can have people that competing directly with each other inside a community, working together to improve the product together. I want to give another example. How many people here have heard of Visual Studio Code? Let's see, I never know my audience. Half the time it's TypeScript and half the time it's Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code is a lightweight editor. Eric Gama, who some of you might know as one of the authors of the Gang of Four design pattern books from the 90s, works at Microsoft. He used to work on Eclipse. And Visual Studio is this great, I both love and hate Visual Studio. It's great if you're using C# and you're willing to install lots of software on your system, and it helps you all the way through the process. But in other language communities and people working on other operating systems, there's much more likely to be a system where it's just like, here's code on the file system. We just want an editor that we can point at it. Debugger's nice, IntelliSense completion, things like that. And so the Visual Studio code base, and I worked on Visual Studio for a little while, there's no way you're ever porting that anywhere. So Eric basically and his team started from scratch, built on Electron, and built this thing, Visual Studio Code. And it's I told you I wasn't going to sell you anything from Microsoft. I'm going to sell you this. And the good point is it's free. So just go try it, and if you don't like it, delete it. It works on Mac, Linux, and Windows. It's easy to install. And a couple things interesting. Last year, the State of the JavaScript survey, they found it was the most popular editor among JavaScript developers. Just last week, or maybe it was the week before, the Golang language survey came out, and it's also the most popular editor among Golang developers. And I looked into that survey a little bit more just to see, and you can see this is not a typical Microsoft community. The largest number of desktop operating system people using Golang in this thing, they're using Linux. Then Mac, there's like one Mac guy, or one Windows guy. And among cloud things, it's like Azure's way, way down the list behind, you know, hosters that I've never heard of. So it's not a typical, like, a bunch of Microsoft people and they love Visual Studio Code. These are people that like Visual Studio Code because they like Visual Studio Code. Another thing about contribution, how many people know what an open source program office is or does? So, Nithya knows very, very well. So if you're a larger company, you have this very likely to have a problem of controlling all of the open source activity that's going on. And I say this it can be bad for the company, and it can be bad for the community, and can be bad in lots of different ways. You do not generally want your developers to understand how the licenses all work. And likewise, developers don't want to know how those licenses work. How many of you have ever signed a CLA, a contributor license agreement? So as a developer, the first time that thing pops up and there's a long list of things that you have to say and it's legalese, it's this like moment of terror, and I need to go find a lawyer to help me understand that. So an open source program office, among other things, they help the developers understand these licenses, and they track them to make sure that they're not misusing the license, not violating the license. They also track all the different versions of the software, so if it needs to be patched or something, we can find the people and say, hey, you know, there's an upgrade and a patch. So Microsoft has got so many open source activity now that a few years ago, we created an open source program office. If Rob today was to try and release Wix, instead of going off and meeting for lawyers for days, he would literally enter into a tool, a description of the thing, what license he wanted to do, and it would be semi-automatically approved. And a few days later, he'd be able to release that software. Now, our open source program office, they have to gather an enormous amount of metadata. Where's the code? What's the license? What's the copyright? Et cetera, et cetera. If you work at Amazon, you have to have where's the code? What's the license? You know, who's the copyright owner? Google, some bank, everybody. And the odd thing is that just the last few years, there's a bunch of projects on the Linux Foundation and others to try and formalize this thing. But there's actually not been much of crowdsourcing or open source applied to this problem. So our open source program office, in conjunction with people at Amazon, Qualcomm, Eclipse Foundation, has open sourced this thing called Clear Defined. It's basically an open source database of metadata about open source projects, which raises the question of whether it's registered with itself. But anyway, this is another example, I think, of us trying to contribute back to community and also gain some power with community. Partnerships. Such as part of this boundary list thing is very big on partnerships. This quote from the book I enjoyed. He said, he stood up on stage and there was a slide saying Microsoft Hearts Linux, and he announced a partnership with Red Hat. And similar to my experience at the Linux Foundation board then. I was involved and still involved very closely with Red Hat, and I love all these. These are a bunch of my other partners in the cloud. But one of the most fascinating things about sitting down with Red Hat was when we realized that we were not competitors. That all those questions about RHEL versus Windows and Java versus .NET, enterprises had made all those decisions, and developers had made all those decisions 15 more years ago. And at that point, we realized that together, we can help our users especially since what they've decided to really do is use both. We can help them much more than we can working individually. And the same goes with these other partners. The .NET team found something similar. This is a little bit of a reverse. So this is the technical steering group members for the .NET Foundation. They get to decide what projects are approved and not approved as part of .NET. And you'll notice here, Red Hat and Google and JetBrains are on these things. These three companies all compete with Microsoft in various ways, and in some cases compete with each other. But the same sort of thing. They have customers that want to use .NET, and at that point, they want to have some influence and know that Microsoft can't just go off and arbitrarily change .NET and break all their customers or break all their products. So they've come in and joined the technical steering group committees. Now, our journey isn't over. We're only partway through. We're not at the end. We're not at the beginning. To paraphrase Churchill, I think we're at the end of the beginning. We still have a lot to learn. But I do want to just give you very quickly a brief overview. We have a lot of other open source activity going. I'm going to call out just a couple real quickly. Microsoft acquired LinkedIn last year, or maybe the year before, I can't remember now. LinkedIn created Kafka and is believed the largest user of Kafka in the world. But it all turned out that Bing was either second or third on that list, long time before LinkedIn was ever part of Microsoft. I mentioned our Hadoop services. R is a statistical language used by data scientists. We're heavily involved with that project. Project Olympus is an open source hardware thing. There's a thing called the Open Compute Project, where Facebook and Microsoft and a series of other companies have open sourced the hardware designs for the servers inside our data centers. If you go out to our booths, someone can show you Bash for Windows, which is exactly, well, isn't quite exactly what it sounds like, but it's actually not just Bash, it's the entire user space of Linux running on top of a kernel emulator so that it runs on top of Windows. We call it Bash for Windows because we don't really think that thing is ready for prime time, as this is your mission critical Cassandra database running on Windows through this kernel emulation thing. But there are so many command line utilities in the Unix world and in the Linux world, and we wanted to get those enabled on Windows, and go on and on. So this is more or less the end of my talk. I wanted to say thank you for having me, and say briefly a few things about we're not done with this journey. The world's going to keep changing. It's just, I don't think it's going to slow down in any sort of way at all, the technological changes. So we're going to have to keep changing with it, and open source will have to keep changing with it too. Our open source culture, we are not done by any means. The understanding of open source and our approach to open source is still evolving every day as around the company. Our open source skill set will improve. If I walk into most buildings at Microsoft, I can still throw a rock and bounce it off two good Windows engineers. A few years ago, any question about Linux went to a very small set of us. That's a much larger group now at Microsoft, but it's still heavily balanced the other way, and that will change as we hire more and more people in those areas over the next few years. And finally, occasionally I get asked, could this change? If Satya or Scott goes away, could we ever go back to being proprietary software, purely proprietary software company, or anti-open source? And I'm going to say no, very distinctly, because the world has changed. All those things I said before, that our people have changed. If someone new came in at the top, they'd still have to convince all, Anders Halsberg, who loves doing TypeScript in open source, and Eric Gama, who loves Visual Studio Code, and our customers who are running Linux on top of Azure, to go somewhere else. So I just don't think that is very likely. But don't trust me. Don't take us by word. Simply watch what we do. I think we're going to do a lot more in open source the next few years. And I hope you agree, and I hope you enjoyed this little history. Thank you.
Hello? There we go. Cool. So thank you very much, Sean, for sharing your journey with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before you take off, we still got some questions and we still got some things for you.
Okay.
So the first is, I mentioned that Scale is a family, and one of the things that we like to do is to thank you for joining us as a keynote speaker, is to welcome
Great.
you to the Scale family. And so we've got your Twitter handle on the back here.
My high school nickname, so having it on the back of a sports jersey is very appropriate.
Yep. So hopefully, we hope you'll wear that proudly. We do have a few minutes for Q&A if folks want to ask John questions about his talk or about Microsoft's open source journey or other topics you may have in mind. While we're doing that, I'll also mention that shortly after this, in this room is Scale 101. All of you that raised your hand and said you're here at Scale for the first time, you're welcome to stay back and ask some questions of the organizers and learn a little bit more about how Scale works and where to find time today. So if you got questions, let me know. Come around to the mic. We'll start over there. We'll work our way back. Yep.
Hi there. I'm Brian from Pandora.
Is it off? There you go.
Hi there, Brian from Pandora Radio. Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask a little more clarifications. What sort of licenses does Microsoft like or approve, or is that a hassle?
It is on. The question was if there were any specific licenses that Microsoft prefers to use for your projects.
Yeah, the default license for things right now that are going up in Microsoft is first to be compatible with the licenses of that community. So obviously, Linux is GPL. We have a lot of things that are Apache because CNCF and Kubernetes and things like that are Apache. MIT is the one by default if there's no other thing. And the Open Source Programming Office will actually advise people on that.
Sure.
Hi, just a comment. One thing that caught my attention was your thing about the. Well, at one time I was a config manager, and I struggled to learn how to use install shield to do installation. So I take it that this thing here makes that a nightmare from the past, and you never will see that again.
Yes.
Thank you.
I had forgotten about install shield, so you mentioned it. Yes.
Could you expand a little bit on the concept of network disaggregation? It sounds kind of like a paradox.
So the question is, could I expand on network disaggregation? Remember when I said that my first 6 months in Azure, I didn't know anything? I still don't know much about software-defined networking. So I've been the wrong person to ask that particular question. Sorry.
SQL Server being the flagship product of Microsoft, how do you think you will make more money when you have MySQL and Postgres in the same stack as SQL Server? So what would you think would be your business model to make more money selling SQL Server, not giving away?
So that's a really great question. I couldn't hear everything you said, but the gist of it I said was, if we have MySQL and Postgres services and SQL Service, how can we make, as a business, more money than we can with just having one? Well, the answer is the customers have spoken. They want multiple different languages and other things. And so that just like Google has gone and said we got to have .NET support in our platform, we have to support multiple language, multiple databases to expand the addressable group of market. That's the pure calculus of the business planner guy.
It seems like with the move of Microsoft towards open source, there's also a big movement towards educating people about Microsoft services. So is that also a possibility for students especially to learn more about Microsoft and be more beneficial to the Microsoft company?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the question is there a way for students to learn more about Microsoft? And in fact, there's a series of things. My colleague here, Jose Miguel Perel, may be able to help you more specifically. But just recently, we worked together with the Linux Foundation to create a series of courses about how to use Linux and use it on Azure. And that program we built partly, obviously for customers and others who want to learn about Linux, but also just honestly, we have so many of our internal staff that don't know much about Linux, and so we've been rolling that training out internally.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, John, for joining us. I think we've probably
Thanks
hit the end
again.
of our Q&A time. I imagine if you still have questions, I imagine John will be around for a few more minutes and would be happy to chat. Otherwise, we'll kick off Scale 101 here in probably about 2 minutes. Phil's going to come on up and we'll chat with you all. Thanks and enjoy the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah. Steve and I chatted for a bit about.
Yeah, okay, so cool.
Thank you.
I'm good. How about you? I didn't know you were here. Yeah.
We had a legal training yesterday, so I thought I would stay on for the other events. How was that? It was very good.
Yeah, I'll grab all my stuff there.
It's been a fun first week at conference.
I'm sorry.